This week was the election, and Donald Trump had a decisive victory over Kamala Harris and will become the second president to serve non-consecutive terms in office once he's sworn in on January 20th. Leftists are currently scrambling to find a proper excuse to explain why a race that was so even in the polls was as one-sided as it was. Or are they? I would argue no, because the reason for Trump's victory is very, very simple. So simple, in fact, that I find it difficult to believe the talking heads on the left overlooked it. So basic that it's unthinkable that the coverage is not a concerted red herring to keep people from realizing that the reason Kamala lost was entirely their fault. So, what is that explanation, and what can we learn from it? Well, this is the part where I risk the pitiful views I get on this channel, and let's be real, my other channel isn't doing that hot either, because we have to look at some math. You've probably seen a lot of bar graphs like these comparing the margins between 2020 and 2024, and if you pay attention, you'll notice that the left's coverage tends to compare Biden and Harris instead of, the competing parties. Harris lost all these points in all these demographics. That's pretty odd. I wonder why they do that, he says sarcastically, as if he doesn't already know the answer. So let's do the obvious thing and compare the actual election results. In 2020, there were 155.5 million votes cast between Republicans and Democrats, 81 million of which went to the Democrats and 74 million of which went to Republicans. In 2024, there were 145.7 million total votes cast between the two, 71 million of which for Democrats, and once again, 74 million for Republicans. So, Republicans didn't lose any votes compared to 2020, and Democrats lost 10 million votes between the elections. So let's observe how that looks when I just throw graphs on screen. The way it looks, and the way the media pundits are presenting it, is that Trump increased his margins, but that is a gross mischaracterization of what actually happened. Yes, he did technically increase his margins, but only by 0.7%, less than 1%. That stat is probably shocking if you've been listening to the talking heads in the media, isn't it? So, why do these graphs look so different? It's because they have different sample sizes, 155.5 million for 2020 and 145.7 million in 2024, but are both representing 100% of the vote cast in each election. Comparing the two graphs when ignoring the sample size shows Trump gained 3 points, when, in reality, Democrats just lost 12.6% of their voters from the previous election. At this point, I hope you figured out why Trump has appeared to increase his margin so much. It's not because he got more popular, it's because Democrats didn't vote. And we see this in all the demographic data as well, or I would say that, but the data is impossible to friggin' find. Take a look at this poll from the AP. They tell us the sample size for their exit polls in 2024, but not for 2020. But a better illustration is to look at one particular poll from NBC News. Now, they've fallen into the same trap of just showing the percentages and ignoring the samples. But there's one particular poll where the sample doesn't actually matter, the loyalty poll. As you can see here, of the Democrats polled, the percentage of Democrats that voted along party lines actually increased from 94% to 95%, and the percentage of Republicans that voted along party lines stayed the same, which, reminder, is actually reflected in the popular vote. So, Trump's margins barely changed, and of the Democrats that actually voted, more actually voted along party lines. The only reasonable conclusion to draw from that is that the increase to Trump's margin everyone is freaking out about is massively overblown. To illustrate that point, let's look at the one that has the most attention right now, the 13-point spike in the Latino vote. For the sake of argument and the benefit of the doubt, let's assume the sample sizes in these polls are the same. Looking at the same NBC polls, we see in 2020, 32% of Latinos voted for Trump. Another article from the Pew Research puts the percentage of Latino voters in 2018 and 2020 midterms at 8 to 9%. For the sake of argument, let's say Latinos really showed up for the presidential elections and made up 14% of the vote, which would mean 72% of all eligible Latinos voted. So, of the 157 million votes cast in 2020, Latinos would have contributed 22 million votes. Of that, 32% or 7 million voted for Trump. In 2024, the Trump vote jumped to 45%, which translates to 8 million votes. So, assuming the sample sizes are the same, in the best case scenario, that translates to an increase of 1 million votes. Keep in mind, that is a vast overestimate. Now, using the same poll, let's look at the white vote, where Kamala gained 2 points. That same article from Pew puts the percent of votes from white people in 2018 and 2020 midterms at 75%. But let's be generous and round the percentage of white voters down to 70%, since we boosted the Latino vote by 5%. That would mean, using the same methodology as before, of the 157 million votes cast in 2020, 109.9 million of them would be white. Of that, 41% or 45 million would have voted for Biden in 2020. What's a 2-point increase to that? 46 million. So, even assuming the sample sizes are the same, buffing the Latino vote by 5% and nerfing the white vote by 5%, that 13% increase wouldn't even make up for the 2% boost Kamala got with white people, and that was the largest increase from the largest minority group. The results of the election simply cannot be explained by Kamala losing voters to Trump. She simply lost voters, period. That's not to say Trump didn't pull some voters. After all, there is that measly 0.7% increase to his actual margins, but it does prove the media is trying to distract you away from the real issue. The reason Democrats lost so handedly in this election is a product of their own failing political strategy. Democrats scoffed when Trump proclaimed the Republican Party as the party of unity. After all, the fascist and populist rhetoric is real, and anyone that denies that isn't living in reality. But it is true when you compare their strategy to the Democrats. The Republican strategy is, we are the good guys, they are the bad guys. Simple, right? And they're united on that front. However, the Democrats are far from united. Gaza? Well, some Democrats would rather guarantee the victory of the Muslim ban guy over the party that will be the least harmful towards Gaza, because they should be more less harmful. Abortion? The only thing they agree on are exceptions for rape, and they tell the men they shouldn't opine on the matter. That's smart. Let's tell 50% of our voter base their voice isn't allowed and doesn't matter. Makes sense. Trans issues? There are people in the trans community that are trying to get rid of Title IX because it doesn't do everything it should. Even though Title IX is one of the most crucial and most cited civil rights laws in our country and is the single most important piece of legislation for non-cis-het individuals to even feel comfortable enough in this country to come out with their identities, let alone argue to get rid of it. Immigration? Well, immigrants seeking asylum should have an easier path to citizenship, even though our judicial system can't even handle the number of claims it's already receiving. Can't vote for a candidate who should be doing this impossible thing that, when they're faced with, they say, just not in my backyard, okay? The economy? Y'all had to caucus with communists and socialists just to compete with Republicans. So, not only is the Democratic Party far from unified, the hills they've chosen to die on aren't even things they could get agreement on in the first place. Abortion, well, half the country are women, some of those women are pro-life, some don't care because they don't think they'll ever need an abortion, some in favor of it will change their mind and decide to carry to term. Principle can only carry you so far. The things that drive people to vote are things they can see affecting them. Let's try another one. Race. There are definitely sound arguments as to the harms of colorblindness, but the vast majority of Americans, even in minority communities, prefer colorblindness. We, for the most part, all agree racism is bad and would prefer not to judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. However, rhetoric on the left has enabled some people of minority races, women, sexual and gender identities, to openly air prejudice and be praised for it. Let me say that again. Democrats decided it was a good strategy to encourage prejudice toward their largest voting demographics. It's ridiculous. And for those of you saying they can't be prejudiced because they're of the oppressed minority, let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine there's a man in Japan. Japan's population is 98% Japanese, so this man is of the controlling majority. This man hates black people, and not just black people, pretty much everyone that isn't Japanese, because xenophobia is kind of just the norm in East Asia. That man comes to the US. Is he no longer racist because he's now in the minority? Of course not. Racism is racism, you dinguses. Trans issues? Y'all really dying on the smallest hill of American demographics for a social issue that doesn't have any meaningful policy measures to address it, and letting them wage war on everyone who doesn't care as much as they should. So, forgive the straw man, but I'm going to simplify the Democrats' political strategy. Let's focus on issues that we can't do anything about, can't agree on, the majority of Americans don't care about, and while we're at it, let's paint people that are openly prejudiced against the largest voter bases in the country as heroes. Oh, and don't forget, we have to preach optimism so people feel entitled for things to be the way they think they should be, and dismiss everything that doesn't jive with the fantasy of their truth. It's incredible Democrats did as well as they did. And let me be clear, since I can already see the strawmans, I'm not dismissing any of these issues. In fact, I think they are important and do need the attention they get, even if I think some of them have no place in politics because there's no legislative means to ensure people do things like respect other people's pronouns. Nor am I saying only white people and/or white men matter. What I am saying is that, rationally speaking, it is absurd to make issues that are divisive within your own party your main talking points, encourage rhetoric that alienates your own voters, and run on hypothetical fantasies with no means of achieving because those fantasies are not the same nor will ever be the same for everyone instead of actual, tangible policy. Here's an inconvenient truth for you. For every person that thinks something should be a certain way, there's someone who thinks it shouldn't be that way. To think your should is more important than their should is straight up narcissistic and wholly ironic, coming from the party that preaches acceptance and tolerance. Voters are adults. Adults have to do things they don't like. You want to be an OBGYN, but don't want to perform abortions? Democrats would say, too bad, it's part of the job. You need to weigh which matters more to you, and if abortions are a no-go, find another career. However, when a half Middle Eastern presidential candidate doesn't give her wholehearted support to Gaza after their ruling party committed Israel's version of 9/11, because that would have been a political nightmare, not just in the US, but on the global stage. I shouldn't have to vote for her. I'll just let the orange man that banned Muslims from entering the country immediately after entering the White House last time call the shots. You've got to be grown-ups. You've got to deal with things you do not like. You've got to make concessions. What you want will not be handed to you, and things will rarely turn out the way you think they should, because the world doesn't exist to coddle picky children. And to the media, you can keep going with your let's go Brandons. He's sharp and with it. She'd be a president for all Americans. Encouragement of bigotry, lying about the cause of Kamala's loss, trying to blame it on her, men, Latinos, and black men, instead of taking responsibility for the world finally reflecting the damage you've caused to your own party. But I'd like to remind you that you poll better with college-educated Americans. They aren't as ignorant as you seem to think they are, and they damn sure can tell when you're insulting their intelligence. But you'd have been able to buy that realization in 2016 if you'd have just paid attention.